that way. So I know we're just after 6. I know Paul said we had almost 30 people registered, but that doesn't mean everybody will join all at once. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. People kind of jump in and out of these roundtables as they can. So this is our first one of this year. The last one we had was sort of our holiday open discussion roundtable. And this one, we thought we really needed to focus on whistleblowing from the nonprofit perspective. And that has been an issue that I think has been really important to people in this space, because we know that it is a double, maybe triple-edged sword. You're working with nonprofits because you believe in the mission and the cause. Same in other sectors, but in this case, whistleblowing could really hamper lines of communication, donation, funding. So programs in and of themselves can become at risk. And we've seen that happen in this space where whistleblowing has resulted in the entire board resigning and the organization having to close up operations. So it's a high risk entity for whistleblowing, and it's hard work. If my day today was like any other day, it's a day where you hit the ground running. You're juggling everything. You're doing a lot. You're trying to make the nonprofit work. Whistleblowers of America is a nonprofit, and it's in and of itself. We have certainly faced our own challenges since 2017. And I know that when you're in this space and you're trying to do all the right things and, dot all the I's, cross all the T's, make sure you're in compliance with all the things that there are to be in compliance with, whether it be the federal rules, the state rules. And I'm so glad Angela is joining us because she even has that international perspective. When you're doing all of that, it can be really hard to want to risk the overall mission of the organization because you care so much about it. So I'm going to introduce Angela, or I'm actually going to let Angela introduce herself and let her talk for a couple of minutes. And then, like we do with all the roundtables, we open up the mics and we let anybody who wants to contribute or has issues they want to discuss, we make this more of like a peer open forum. So Angela, I'm very delighted to have met you only recently, but if you can tell us a little bit more about you and your work and how you've kind of come to this topic, I think the group will enjoy hearing from you. And you're on mute.
Good evening, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you all are joining from. Thank you first, Jackie. Thank you for inviting me. Paul, thank you for inviting me as well. So just a little bit about myself. I when people ask me how I came into the nonprofit space, and specifically I work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at this time, I'm sure DEI is in the news everywhere, and there's a lot of consternation around DEI. But I came into this space because I'm a professional. I'm an international development professional. So almost all of the work I've done has been in the international space. That could range from working in Haiti after the earthquake with Oxfam to working in Uganda with Bloomberg Philanthropies on road safety. Often organizations that are working in those spaces, grant-funded organizations, are almost always nonprofits. And so I came to this space because I was interested in working in the mission-driven environment. I never saw myself, in a bank or, doing any of those kinds of jobs. I always saw myself working in a space where I would be able to have impact on people whose lives are vulnerable for a lot of reasons, whether we're talking about immigration, refugees, people living, without unhoused, whatever the situation. But that's the nonprofit space. The nonprofit space that's the focus. And so I came to the space understanding that that was the work I was going to do. And then within that nonprofit world, there's a lot of systems, where racism, gender issues come together, ethnic issues all collide in the nonprofit environment. And it's even exacerbated by sort of like this world of grant funding and what organizations have to do to get some of this grant money to keep the doors open to run the programs that they run. And so there's a bunch of systemic sort of intersectional issues that come up, which complicates the nonprofit environment. And so I got to thinking a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, starting way before 2020, actually, maybe around like 2012, when there were sort of reports about abuse of people in some of these countries by nonprofit leaders, by grantors, because there's a lot of room for abuse in the development sector, and certainly in the nonprofit part of the development sector. And so I started to write a lot about racism and gender in the nonprofit space. And then that just, as we started to talk more about it and get more involved in it, I ended up sort of going out on my own and going into consulting. And I am a very, very sort of niche consultant. I do not pretend to understand DEI in every aspect of DEI. I work on diversity, equity, and inclusion only with international organizations, only with organizations like USAID, only with organizations like Oxfam, organizations who the organization is perhaps based in the US, but they work with people who are vulnerable all over the world. And so I have the DEI lens, but looking at it from an international environment. And so that's basically all about me. And that's how I got into the work. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a helpful introduction. So I think that from this perspective, one of the things I'm sorry, I'm trying to fix something on my computer. Oh no. But from the perspective of working on these kinds of issues, what happens when somebody makes a disclosure or tries to, share when something's wrong, especially when you're talking about diversity and inclusion type issues? How are we then supposed to, or how could nonprofits react better than they sometimes do?
Right. They often react badly. And that's maybe an understatement. They react badly for a lot of reasons. The first big thing is grants, right? They're mostly grant funded. So if you're an organization and you're getting grant money from the big boys, I call them, right? So I'm talking, Bloomberg Philanthropies or Gates Foundation. I mean, when you're getting money from those organizations, and then you have allegations of whatever, whether we're talking racism, sexual abuse, which is often one of the big ones, right? Abuse of people who receive your grant. There's an immediate tendency to want to keep it in-house, almost knee-jerk, right? Let's bring in a crisis person, and let's talk amongst ourselves, and let's police ourselves. But people can't police themselves, right? Organizations don't police themselves well. We know that, right? But that is often the way that the conversation starts. And then it becomes a cover-up as when there's this sense that the victim may feel unheard, right? And so the victim now is saying, well, I want more than what you're talking about. Often in the development space, what happens is, especially in cases of sexual abuse, which is not infrequent, I should be very honest about that. And so you may read about some of the times when it comes up, when it's a big news story. But by the time it gets to be a big news story, there may be complaints that may have been under the rug for years, right? By the time it gets to be a big news story, because by the time it gets to be a big news story, it is probably because maybe they didn't do enough at one point. Maybe the culprits were not terminated. Oftentimes, what they do with the culprits is they ship them off to another place, another country, to go do what they were doing. So there's this sort of mentality of the way that it is handled. And so because what often happens is that they'll prey on your sort of sympathy, or your empathy, rather than sympathy, your empathy, because they'll be like, something like this could really bring down our organization. Something like this could really hurt. And what about the children or the people that we serve? And once you put all those dynamics together, you may go on for another couple of years with different sorts of things happening without it becoming really public. And maybe and I want to caveat by saying that may have been truer, say 5 years ago, maybe even, but I think now the secrecy attached to this has changed quite a bit. And partly because of social media, partly because people are less afraid, partly because people in some of these parts of the world feel empowered in a way that was not always the case. Right. So that's how, that's the kind of sort of environment that you could see what whistleblowing might look like for some of these issues.
Yeah, no, so I'm nodding along because, so much of what you just mentioned, I think is one of the reasons we thought this deserved a spotlight, because we know that these organizations, although they do so much good work, there's also this risk and these underlying dysfunctional cultures that are at play. And I'm like you mentioned, Oxfam. I've seen out of the UK. There have been stories about Oxfam. There have been stories about, I've met with the whistleblower from Boy Scouts of America. He's one of their senior leaders. And the fact that they had pedophiles within the organization that were preying on these young boys. And it took decades for these boys to be men to come forward and feel confident enough to talk about the sexual abuses that they experienced.
Right. And there's also another aspect of it. It's a mentality as well. Nonprofits are very, very specific. There's a humanistic sort of do-gooder kind of mentality. When you say to someone, I work in investment banking, it doesn't engender warm fuzzies, right? Think, oh my God, you're saving the world. No. Most times we have a negative opinion of investment bankers, maybe because of television or whatever. But you say you work in humanitarian intervention. Come on, there's this kind of you get bathed in the glow of do-gooder. Of the do-gooder mentality. And so it's a mentality that sort of gives rise to the way people function in development organizations and in the nonprofit world, because it's nonprofit. And I think that's part of the problem, and part of while on one hand it's great, it has a baked-in weakness.
Yes, I agree. Like when you were talking earlier about how these investigations are internal, that we don't report these things as crimes because we're protecting the reputation of the organization, because what you're ultimately protecting is that donor base. Because as soon as donors find out that there are problems within the organization, they're going to pull their sponsorship, funding dries up.
Right.
And
right.
then you sort of become, oh yeah, that organization.
Right. And it's hard to rebuild that reputation.
Yes, yeah, it's hard for me to think of Boy Scouts of America and not think of why it was in the news lately.
Right, absolutely.
So, I mean, and I know we have other people that are on the line that have, and Paul, I think you can allow people we can let them raise hands or unmute and join the conversation as well. Because I see where some folks are coming from the nonprofit space or might have similar experiences that they might want to share. I mean, the purpose of the roundtable is to really make this more of an open discussion rather than a traditional webinar where you have speakers or panelists and no interacting dynamic. We try to make these a little more interactive. So I know some of you are out there and know the nonprofit space well. So please, when you're ready.
Yeah, raise your hand and I can unmute you.
But we've got a shy group starting this year. But
if you don't know how to raise your hand, there's at the bottom of, okay, we got somebody. Okay.
Yeah, we're just seeing a letter K.
All right, you should be able to unmute now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for convening this discussion. I'm sorry to say that unfortunately it's particularly relevant to me. And unfortunately I was advised that liberal organizations, including nonprofits, can be the worst offenders regarding EDI issues, ironically. So I guess, I'm seeking organizational accountability without, ideally without the acrimony of litigation, and my preferred path would be for this, with a positive finding from the EEOC, which I understand to be rare. I would like for this to go through their board of directors. And I guess I'm just wondering, at the same time that I've been advised that, the board's not going to care, or, I did hear what you just said. So, I mean, if anyone wants to follow up with me, I welcome any thoughts or advice about navigating this, but I guess I'm just wondering, I guess that for me is sort of an opportunity to say what I need to say in terms of, how this has, significantly affected me, and, but also to keep it focused on, on the actual issues that I would like to address with the organization, with the people who know it best, and who, and who are, and to whom the organization is supposedly accountable. Thank you.
So I think accountability is one of these key pivot points where we see, like in in government and with the EEO, and you have these entities that are supposed to be the people in the places that have that role, and it still can be very hard to get them to be responsive, and these things take forever. I mean, it's not uncommon for whistleblowers to kind of lay in abeyance. Even at the EEOC, these cases can take 5 to 10 years, and then very often the person is out of pocket. So we spend a lot of money, our own money, to adjudicate these cases. And I think that's really where we want to see, I think, better accountability. And how do you, I mean, if you're going to do this, let's say you only want to do this internally, what are some of the recommended or better strategies? Is kind of maybe even an open question, because I don't know that I even have all the answers on this. What makes this better? I mean, what could we be doing to do this right?
Well, I mean, it's one of the questions about, I mean, why do I mean, whistleblowing usually starts internally, right? And so, I mean, the naive, simple answer is that when you report a problem, that it gets, addressed and corrected, right? And so I don't know. I mean, I'll stop talking. Thanks.
I have a question for Kay, just a comment and a question. I'm wondering, you say that you said something that the board is not going to care. Is that true? Is that
that's
a
I mean,
fact?
I don't. That's what someone told me. Like,
Okay.
like
You don't
I mean,
know
it's sort of. I mean, quite frankly, it's like, it's like what happened. I mean, I'm a serial whistleblower, and it's like what happens with with reporting misconduct internally. Retaliatory investigation, cover up, blah 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 blah. And so on the one hand, I want to believe that the nonprofit, you want to believe that the nonprofit world, particularly given the mission of certain organizations, is different. I mean, I want to believe that, but I'm a serial whistleblower. Like, how? And as one of my like, when am I ever going to learn that we do not live in a perfect world, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like a moth to, I'm a moth, drawn toward a flame of controversy and pain. I mean, I can't help it. So I mean, I guess it was just someone whose EQ is quite high who said this to me. And I've not yet, I don't know if they would even allow this, but that's I guess that would be sort of my first,
Right.
My preferred path.
I have a recommendation,
But
if you don't mind. I'm on a board right now, and there's a role on the board where there's a board committee that is linked to the office and to the personnel. And whilst it's true that boards of directors do not generally engage in direct personnel issues, other than when it comes to the conduct and the fiduciary responsibilities of a CEO, but some boards have committees where boards hear these kinds of situations. I would recommend, as a start, to sort of maybe allow you to get your bearings in how you might want to proceed with that. Looking at what is in your organizational board handbook, for example, and finding out whether there's a committee. There may be, because if there is, you can write, you can bring the board into the conversation. And I'll just say this. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news, but 2 weeks ago, a Black woman, an African-American woman at a university in Missouri, killed herself. And she killed herself and left behind, she wrote that she was really bullied and harassed. And this is a PhD person, a qualified woman who had a job, I think, VP of student affairs, maybe. She killed herself. And I'm saying this to you to say that the board that's where the pressure is right now in this university, because this board of curators, when the woman reached out to the board, and this is a highly placed person at the university, so she's not, you know what I mean, and she was told by the board, we don't get involved in personnel matters. I can tell you that this board is under all kinds of fire. In fact, all of them maybe ultimately be dismissed anyway. And I'm just telling you that example to say that these sort of stories have really begun to change the way we understand the role of the board and the focus of the board. So whilst your person who told you that may be correct, I would ask if you could, before you make that determination, find out what or if there exists a liaison on one of those board committees to the organization and to personnel. And that might be, and if it exists, and many boards do, if it exists, that might be a place for you to start.
No, Angela, I think that's a really good suggestion, because and communicating with a board of directors is also sort of putting an organization on a sort of formal official notice. It creates a record. At some point, nobody can say, well, we didn't know about this. If only we knew, we would do something about it.
Exactly.
I think I saw Robert had his hand up a minute ago. I lost track of him, but Robert, are you? Yeah, there you are.
Can you hear me?
There
Yeah,
you are.
okay.
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you.
Right, thank you. I was struck by what Angela said that I think is foundational to us, the way we approach many of the things you're talking about here, which is that, organizations don't self-police well at all. And that's probably the understatement of this in prior centuries. So they don't really self-police. And so when we get people, if you're early enough in the process, unless you have someone somewhat in a group, somewhat independent, and I've seen the successful, incredibly successful, like a union. Okay, so if you go to the board, you start doing this stuff, you're basically slotted into this long-term litigation torture, which can come out of pocket. Probably don't want to kill yourself like most people. So, if you don't want those options, if you're lucky enough to have a really powerful, that's great. I've seen that work. If it's not so powerful, I've seen that with doctors and PhD scientists, it's not going to help you as much as you might think, if at all. So what we do is, with people who don't have any of those options and they want to have their career, first thing we do is say, get out. Don't blow the whistle yet. It's first, save yourself. It's kind of like the airplane. Put your mask on first. You get out first alive, and then we're preparing how to blow the whistle and make it harder for them to target you. So that's just my thought on it. It came from what Angela said, which really is the bottom line, which is, it's going to be a tough thing. Unless you bring power to the table right away, you're going to potentially get targeted. So that's just, I thought
Robert, I think you're right. I mean, the save yourself first is, lots of lawyers would give that advice, because they know that their clients, are really putting themselves at risk. So try to be as anonymous and confidential as you can, and then try to either find something somewhere else. And then I do see Bali has her hand up, and Erica. So let's bring them into this as well. Bali, I think you were first.
Yes, my advice to Kay, I have two pieces of advice. One is read the books on like the whistleblower handbooks. If you have not already read books like Rules for Whistleblowers and things like that, there are maybe 3 or 4 handbooks like that. And get a lawyer if you can get one, even if you think you don't want to sue, because like if you can find a public interest lawyer that will talk to you about your situation, you can do something short of that. Like you can have a lawyer write a letter, but with, which will sometimes convince an organization that they actually need to do something about what you've reported. But it can be dire. I mean, the retaliation that you experience can be dire. And I think it's worth looking at some of the whistleblower handbooks that talk about the consequences, because I think Lisa Bowman, wasn't she United Way? She was a very high-ranking person with United Way, and I think she didn't get any kind of resolution with her situation. So it can be very scary. And until we have better whistleblower protections, you really have to think about how it's going to affect you. There are also journalists. You can also do something like try to file reports, and particularly if you've got a group of people that are having the same problem, sometimes you can get journalists interested in it. Like we have some public interest journalism organizations in California that have covered some of the just incredible problems with going through government agencies when you're trying to report something. And then the other thing is document everything via email. Like, you see somebody in person, just to follow up to our conversation in which we mentioned blah, blah, blah. Because if you do it orally, they're going to say, no, we don't remember that. That never happened. So create like an evidence, a trail of evidence that they're not going to be able to just, so that they can't just dismiss what you tried to report. That's my advice. Okay.
No, I think that's good advice. And each case is going to be different. And and I always tell people there's a big difference between your opinions, facts and evidence is about meeting legal standards. It's not whether you're right or wrong, but it's about what you can really prove. And again, even with these nonprofits, the law still is going to demand a certain type of response. And I saw Erica still has her hand up and she's still here. So Erica, good to see you. Welcome. Welcome to the board too, by the way. Erica just joined our board.
Thank you. Hi, Jackie. Hi, Angela. Thanks for holding this conversation. I had a question more on what you guys would understand as what could be best standards of what a nonprofit could implement, especially with the different range of sizes that they might have. So I've been working with a small nonprofit. They had an issue where they had an interim CEO or executive director. Things didn't quite go well. There was a bit of a discrimination case. And so now they brought in a new executive director and they're trying to implement better best practices. But finding out what that is can be challenging. Do you guys have any model organizations that you think are good standards or best practices of any type of, I don't know, association that sort of does this well? And on the front of the people who are carrying this to the board, it's kind of the employees who are advocating for this. Like, hey, we didn't feel that our fellow employees were protected. We want to advocate to sort of have change here now that there's this new executive director who's going to be more permanent in that position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Erica, I'm going to say the best model is Whistleblowers of America, right? That we're doing everything right and everything perfect.
Yeah.
But I agree. I've seen everything from like our little small organization, which is mostly volunteer based, with a very small budget, trying to make sure that we have all our bylaws, that we have employee handbooks, that we're always reviewing and updating those things. We have what we call a compliance officer, who's part of our executive committee. To when I've seen some of the bigger nonprofits, and I've been on boards for huge nonprofits. I was an employee of the American Legion. One of the top 10 organizers, used to be one of the top 10 nonprofits in the United States. And so it's always, I think, the challenge of if you're really going to police yourself, you have to be mindful of yourself first. And I think just sort of having that to-do checklist of things that at least give you the opportunity to be in touch with what's going on in your world, what's going on around you, and is what you say you're doing on paper, is it what you're really doing? So are your bylaws, your strategic plan, your budget, are all of those things in line with each other? That's not always an easy thing to juggle, but I think it's something that a board should have the first and foremost responsibility of. And I see Dave has his hand up too. So Dave?
Hi, how you guys doing?
Another board member, by the way.
I'm not really familiar with how whistleblowing works within nonprofits, obviously just from being a government or sort of former government employee. But I'm wondering if somehow the person who is doing the whistleblowing or is going through any type of harassment could get someone to take up their case, a journalist of some sort. The more public it becomes, that means you have an opportunity for other people to join you, because I'm sure that if there's one, there's more than one. The more the merrier. And if one person's going through it, people that do this, I'm familiar with cases within the government where I had friends of mine, women coming up to me and saying, hey, so-and-so, who I knew the guy, was sexually harassing them. And I said, well, you need to complain. And they were afraid. And I said, you're not the only one, you know that. And they said, we know, but we're still afraid. And they ended up quitting. And the people that did this ended up getting promoted. And I don't know again how it works in nonprofit, but I think it should be different in more private industry or nonprofit, where if there's other people that can join you, then you're more protected at that point. So that's really all I just wanted to say.
No, Dave, those are good points, because I think, again, part of why we created this organization was so that nobody felt like they stood alone against the Goliath organizations that they work for. Because even small nonprofits can feel intimidating when you're the only one willing to speak out about something that's not right at the organization. And I wanted to pivot because I saw Andrea had put in the chat about looking for resources that help people deal with the trauma suffering from wrongful termination as a result of whistleblowing. I mean, that is I think a common problem that we see is the whistleblower is the one who gets terminated, not necessarily the perpetrator. So you can do all the right things, you can make all the right disclosures, and still be the one that ends up in trouble. And I think we said earlier, the one spending the hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight these cases when you're not the one who did anything wrong. And I think the trauma and the mental health piece of this is something that's been really important to me and to us as an organization. Is so how do you build resilience after whistleblowing? And I think this thing goes back to when Kay said she's a serial whistleblower. To me, that speaks to what the trauma is. We have this tendency, especially as whistleblowers, when people don't believe you, and you suffer from gaslighting and marginalizing and mobbing, is to constantly reenact the trauma as if to get to the place where somebody's going to believe you and you're going to feel vindicated. And I mean, I've seen this with like combat vets as well. The only time you ever really feel vindicated is when you own your own narrative. And there has to be a point in all of this where you know your own truth, whether you have the facts or the evidence to prove it. You just have to know in your heart that you did what you did, given the time, place, and circumstances, that you did the best that you could do with this issue, and you should be proud of yourself for what you did. But then you also have to figure out, well, how do I move on with my life and still find mission, meaning, and purpose? Are there other nonprofits? Are there other areas of interest? Are there other places to go? And I think there are several people on this call. I won't call anybody out, I promise. I'm not going to break your confidentiality. But I know there are many of us, me included, where people have had to do that and have had to come up with a new strategy or a new plan and give themselves permission to take a break from the whistleblowing. I mean, some of these organizations like Oxfam, Boy Scouts, I mean, they've gone through some really horrible internal problems, and yet the organization is still there. Now, some nonprofits I know have had to close their doors, or they've had to rebrand or regroup as a nonprofit. I think we've seen that too, especially in international development. I've seen organizations pop up and then go away, and then sort of pop up as with a different name or something else as we redefine who we are. And I mean, I think those are the hard questions. Those are the hard things we have to ask ourselves too. Angela, are you gonna say something? I didn't mean to cut you off. No,
not at all. Not at all. I'm listening to some of the things you're talking about, and I think it was Robert who I think made a good point, which, save yourself first, right? That's like fair. And I was sharing with Jackie that I've been hanging. I know some young people who have been really who decided to fight back in their organization. And I think it might have been David who talked about the public aspect of it. There are reporters who, especially now, stories about, abuse. People write about this now in a much more, a much better way than they did even say 10 years ago. And so I know in one of the cases that I know of, some young women that decided to use Twitter when it was Twitter about 2 or 3 years ago to bring down an organization. And it was, remarkable in that, these 3, young Black women pursued an organization for, saying that it was a toxic, racist environment that was sort of led by the CEO, right? If you look up Women Deliver, right around 2020, and it has been reorged. And when I say reorged, I mean from the top, right? But if you look them up, you'll get information on how, these women just basically, what these women decided to do. And I'm just saying that to talk about save yourself first, right? I agree. And also there's a public aspect to this, especially now that, that we live in a social media world. So those were just the 2 things I wanted to add.
No, I appreciate that. And I also appreciate that Bali is putting some really good articles and citations in the chat. You've got a couple of things in there I'm really familiar with. The Jennifer Freed's work on Darvo, I think, is also important. And some of these other tools that really help us heal, I think, are also things that we have to consider. Again, you always do have to put yourself first, no matter how important the mission is. But also know, like, when is it time, or be able to give yourself permission to walk away. Because at some point, if you don't have the support and the group dynamics and and your family, we've talked a lot about whistleblower families in other sessions. If you don't have the tools in your toolkit, sometimes it's okay to either take a break, walk away. There's nothing wrong with doing something else even if it's for a little while. Those things are important.
And I also think that knowing what you just said about grace and all of that is also a part of it, right? Sometimes these situations, people feel isolated. It might be, resources in terms of like accessing what might also, what else is this discussion about? What other things am I maybe missing? When do I give myself permission to walk away? And I say that really in all earnestness, because the woman in the University of Missouri, that is like a real serious, it was an HBCU, historically Black college and university. And as a person who graduated from an HBCU, and knowing that the mission of the HBCU is about protection, right? It's about a safe place. It's a place where, African-American people went to school, were able to get education in this country. So you imagine in a place where that's the mission, and here you have this person being unable to cope with the harassment and the bullying and the mobbing, and that was the choice that she made. That's real and harsh. And so I think it's important to be in that place that you said, Jackie, about when do you give yourself time to know when you walk away, know when it's time to give yourself grace, because it could be isolating and overwhelming, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think the sense that I had, I was working in the suicide prevention space with the government, and I realized anything I said is going to sound like sour grapes. Like, nobody's going to give credibility to anything I said, no matter how good I had been or how much I had done or any of the other things I thought I had achieved and accomplished. Those things no longer mattered. So I left that space, and then over time I found this space, and I found another population where things made sense to me. And, you know, people have heard me say suicide is the fourth leading cause of death among working aged adults in America. The workplace matters. And when we can't or are not able to hold it accountable for what we think are the wrongs, and we can't find the advocates, the journalists, or the lawyers who are hearing us, sometimes it's okay to pause and reinvent your space. And sometimes you have to reinvent your space or find another space where you can feel impactful without completely letting your life be overtaken by these perpetrators. And that's why I say we have to own our narrative as a means of restorative justice. Kay has her hand raised again.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. I guess I just wanted to quickly clarify regarding what I said earlier. I have gotten into it over different issues over time, not the same issue, but it just doesn't. But I do agree with what you were saying, and which also reminded me of Fred Alford's writing, which someone else cited about how you just, you know, I mean, the life of a whistleblower just becomes a series of events. But I did want to, you know, acknowledge the previous question about, you know, resources for dealing with the trauma, where, you know, where I guess my understanding of the helpful resources that are cited that, you know, that lend credence to the realities and horror of whistleblower trauma. Mm-hmm. You know, I think the question is, how do you get to the other side, you know, when you're stuck, yes. Or when whistleblowing is a lifelong trauma, right? And so, you know, suggestions, you know, of, you know, literature that might be helpful in that regard would be helpful. You know, I'm aware of GAP, you know, talking about recovery and renewal through vindication, et cetera, which, you know, is a kind of a holy grail. I mean, it's rare, right? Yeah, and so, you know, any suggestions that people might have might be helpful also to the person who asked the question. Thanks.
Yeah, no, so I think that in and of itself is a whole different night of roundtable conversation on the actual trauma. And that's, you know, that's been my book, The Psychosocial Impacts of Whistleblower Retaliation. And I think the idea of holding people accountable and that need for vindication might not necessarily ever come from an external source. And that's why I keep saying it's got to be from within. We have to believe we did the best we could and be proud. And I think when there is other trauma, when there is anxiety and real fears, agoraphobia, not wanting to go outside anymore, when there are those real feelers, then that's where, you know, I honestly would recommend somebody be working more one-on-one with a therapist or in a trauma survivor group, just like we've done with combat vets and law enforcement officers, widows, cancer patients. You know, the idea that therapy and group therapy, some of the cognitive behavioral therapies, the energy therapies, I mean, some of these things really do work and they really can help somebody with their trauma. But I think I also saw Sarah and Dave had his hand up. Sarah, you still here? All right, well, Sarah maybe figures it out. Dave, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I think your points are very well taken. And I believe, I guess in my opinion, having dealt with this also for a number of years, the best resource, I think, for a whistleblower outside of the therapy, which I think is extremely important, the best resource is another whistleblower who who's come out with their head on straight. And the thing to remember is that the percentage of whistleblowers, I don't even know what it is, who quote win their case, I'm sure is very low. But even those that win their case, trust me, I've spoken to them, they don't want to deal with it anymore. And they still suffer from the trauma. And I could tell you for a fact of someone I wanted to interview when I was doing my dissertation, and they said to me, even though they won their case, they won millions of dollars, and they said, no, I'm not, I really can't do it. And I understood, as a whistleblower, I understood right away what he meant. It wasn't that he now doesn't want to do it, it's that bringing it all up again was just so traumatic. It just was just horrendous. And I know we've, in different, I know we've had different situations, we've spoken, there have been other people that, other whistleblowers, if you don't have family support, if you don't have friend support, it's just terrible. It's really, really difficult. And sometimes I would tell, I'm throwing a kudo in for Jackie in terms of the therapy, but Jackie will put you in touch with people who've been through it and who can listen to you, who understand. And not necessarily that they've won in terms of the case, but they've won and they said, we're not going to allow them to win and change me personally as a personality. I've won over them, so to speak. And that's something that a whistleblower has to recognize, that you might not win your case, but you can't let them hurt you on a physical or emotional level. And for sure, therapy, but, you know, have another whistleblower to speak to.
Yeah, so I think that's the space we're trying to create with these roundtables. And I see Paul and Andrea. So this month we're doing, we're specifically focusing on the nonprofit sector, but we have, we focused on law enforcement and government. We try every month to just have a different theme to kick off the conversation. I think that just, just helps sort of get a conversation going, but each month we try to do a different theme. I think next month we're actually in recognition of Martin Luther King and Black History Month, we're going to be talking about whistleblowing while Black and talk about this from a racial perspective as well. And we've had all kinds of issues come out of the discrimination EEO world. So, I mean, that is kind of what we're queuing up for next month. We just thought this would be an interesting conversation because I think for whistleblowers in the nonprofit space and in professional spaces like academia, mental health, other professions where your identity is so tied to the mission of your organization, this becomes a really hard decision to make because you really believe so strongly in what the organization was doing. You don't want to do anything that will unravel the organization, but in the same time, you want that balance where there's accountability. And I think some of the things Dave was talking about earlier with finding the right people, finding the right family are really some of the things that are the most helpful. And Bali, you've had some really great comments in the chat. I just saw you put something else in there. Did you have something else you'd like to add? Nope, Bali raised her hand. Paul? Can we get her to join?
Yeah, give me 1 second. Having a hard time finding, oh, there it is. All right, you should be good, Bali.
Okay. Hi there. Yeah, basically what I think, I have read about and met whistleblowers in all different contexts, and I actually think that the basic experience is very, very similar. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a government worker, a police officer, a nurse, that sees, something bad happening in a hospital, a person in a school that sees something bad going on. It's really a very, very similar experience. And so although I do think it's interesting to have different nonprofit focus or whatever, we all have a lot of stuff in common, regardless of what particular industry, we have experience in at least in my personal experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, from an international perspective, the UN Coalition Against Corruption just had their 10th annual state parties session, and whistleblowing, or the reporting, what was it? The reporting of protected persons or persons reporting persons. They didn't call it whistleblowing because of the nuance that the word whistleblower is an English word, doesn't necessarily translate well. But we see this very much happening all over the globe. I mean, Oxfam, I think, is headquartered in the UK, if I'm not mistaken.
Oxfam America, Oxfam Great Britain, yes.
Yes.
But there's other Oxfams that are headquartered in different parts of the world. It's a federation, but yes.
But we definitely, see and hear from this space all over the world. I mean, Oxfam is the one that now comes to mind, because I know actually a few whistleblowers who were involved with Oxfam, but other smaller civil societies and charities operating in other countries that have had to contend with these issues, and how to best address when there's corruption, even in the nonprofit space. How do you mentor and develop leaders? And I think that was something that I was talking to a man from Nepal, and he was talking about how, they see this as a generational issue, and that if you're not cultivating the young talent into your organizations that have an education, a frame of reference for ethical behavior, then you're never going to change culture, because you haven't changed the people who are running the culture. All right, we're getting to the top of the hour. I know I try to keep these on time. Does anybody else have any other thoughts or anything else they wanted to contribute? Oh, Sarah, you are here. Yeah, I think I saw Sarah earlier. Are you unmuted?
I think so. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yay. That's exciting. Yeah, so I'm a whistleblower against Peace Corps. And so I can certainly relate to almost everybody on this call, in the sense that Peace Corps is a government agency. It's an international organization as well. And it's a humanitarian sort of endeavor, right? And so it really transcends kind of all of those different areas and spaces that we've kind of really been talking about over the past hour or so. And I really just kind of wanted to respond to the dynamic of, how do you get your sense of whistleblower identity resolved once you have blown the whistle? And as somebody who had spent, well over a decade in trying to hold Peace Corps accountable related to their abuse of authority and their distribution of the anti-malarial medication mefloquine, I was never able to hold Peace Corps accountable. I was never able to secure an attorney. Despite that, I still sued Peace Corps. I lost. And that kind of proved my point that Peace Corps was specifically waiting to distribute this drug overseas to evade legal liability. I then tried to pursue whistleblower protection with the Office of Special Counsel. That was also denied because Peace Corps volunteers are volunteers. They're not considered federal employees. I've talked to countless reporters. I've had hundreds of meetings on the Hill. I've had 2 pieces of legislation that really haven't gone anywhere. And, and so through these years of really trying to hold Peace Corps accountable, for me, it has been really difficult to reconcile the fact that I really wanted to hold this agency that had harmed me accountable. But on the other hand, I'm not able to. And so I have had to really reckon with the fact that I've done everything I can to really make sure that no other Peace Corps volunteer suffers in the way that I suffer. And that's really what I have to hold as my truth. And I think, especially operating in the humanitarian space or working with organizations that have altruistic purposes, I think it's important to frame the messaging around the fact that you're really just trying to make sure that the organization is better, that the donor funds are spent more responsibly, that we are actively working to make these organizations better and to propagate better practices. And so I think, especially operating in this space, it's really important to ensure that the messaging is to highlight the fact that you're just trying to make these organizations better. And so I'm sorry, I think my messaging is kind of discouraging, but at the same time, I think it's a very real threat or very real risk that for whistleblowers, we get very lost. And, and I've even also had years of therapy, and so I have tapped into all of these different resources. I have tried these different paths and avenues. And really at the end of the day, you just have to ensure that what you did was what you wanted to do and move on with your life. And that certainly doesn't take away the pain and the suffering that you've had to endure. But at the end of the day, I have to look at myself in the mirror. Nobody else is going to. So I apologize if we're kind of ending on a discouraging note, but yeah, I really appreciate this conversation, and thanks everybody for sharing.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sarah, I'm glad we got you unmuted so that we can hear from you, because your story really is compelling. And I think you're right. It is about the looking forward and knowing that you did the best you could, and and not knowing what opportunities might still be ahead. I think there's always that hope lives sense for a lot of whistleblowers, in that maybe the time for the fight isn't right now, but there might be a time. I think Angela was talking about the Me Too movement earlier, that it took that tidal wave of coming together and people willing to stand together for that change to happen. And I'm a believer that as whistleblowers come together, a high tide can raise all ships. But I think I saw Rebecca had a hand up. Rebecca, are you?
Hi, good evening.
Oh, there you are.
I just wanted to weigh in for people who, if you're one of these people, or if you ever talk with somebody who's in the nonprofit space and feels like they're going to be undermining the mission because of what happens. I was not in the nonprofit space. I was in the philanthropic space. So I was on the other end of it. And I assure you, it's much worse on that end. Much worse. And I actually did my dissertation in how donors make their funding decisions. So why they fund or why they would cut funding. And the networks and how they feel about people have such a huge impact on it. But if they like you, you really can do no wrong. Unless it really, really dreadfully embarrasses them, you're not going to lose your funding. So what gets swept under the carpet, and again, on that end, nobody polices them. They're the ones who make the rules. So it's even worse on that end. And that's just what I wanted to weigh in with.
No, Rebecca, I appreciate that, because I think we were sort of lumping a lot of this together in the nonprofit space and thinking about the donors and what the donors are willing to do or put up with. We we think of them as always being the altruistic parties in all of this, but even there, the donors are making donations because they want to buy influence.
Very
And
much.
I'm going to get a copy of your dissertation because now I want to read it.
Oh, I'm happy to give it to you. I didn't, and why your book is so important, I never met anybody who had the problems I had. And then when I read your book and we did that podcast, that's the first time that I understood my experience as a whistleblowing experience, but I had no frame of reference for that. And it was very, very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what has motivated me is I feel like I've taken what I've learned from working with the military and veterans, and I see this need for a framework in this space when there's been a hostile work environment and you've tried to do the right thing, and now you're the one under attack.
Yeah.
Dave, I think I saw your hand went back up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm raising my hand a lot now. I'm hearing so many different things. After Sarah and Rebecca spoke, I said, okay, I got to say something. I have to add one other thing to what Sarah said that I totally agree. From my experience, I think Jackie, you found the same experience. Number one, you have to move forward. Looking back will only just drive you crazy. And if you take a look at all the EEOC, OFC, all the different acronyms, all they're supposed to be there to help, they don't. That's not been my experience. Anybody I've approached really has not been helpful. So I don't want to sound like, oh, yeah, it's terrible. It's not. If you look forward, like I use working out, I use running as to help me. And just like, I think when Jackie, you wrote a book, or Becky wrote a book, I wrote a book, and it helped me a lot to deal with the situation. And it's just very important that we don't rely on I'm not saying not to go with the organizations, but don't rely on those organizations, because if you start relying on organizations, you put all your oomph into it, you're going to be very disappointed if things don't work out. And I've been doing my stuff for a long time, for many years. I'm like the poster child to almost for government whistleblowers, which is not a good thing to say. I couldn't even admit that. But it's just very important that you recognize that you really have to look at things and move forward and recognize that this is the way to go. And you have other whistleblowers to talk to. So I'll keep quiet.
No, Dave, I appreciate that. So, and I think for these roundtables and for these discussions, I always walk away feeling like I've learned something or I've heard something that gives me pause and gives me something more to think about. I'm always so thrilled and honored when I see people coming together and making connections and reaching out and supporting, because that's who we really are. I think as people, whistleblowers do tend to be altruistic and outgoing and maybe not personalities all the time, but I think we care about what we're doing and who we are involved with. So I'm going to give one last reminder. If you haven't put your contact information in the chats, please do. If you obviously, unless you're trying to stay anonymous, that's fine too. But we do want to create a community in these forums where people feel safe in coming together. So I really do. I appreciate everybody. I thank you. Our next roundtable is February 27th. It'll be the Whistleblowing While Black. So we'll talk about racism and discrimination and the types of issues that people face when they're whistleblowing. If you've got any other topics or you want to be on any panels, if you want to do what Angela did for us tonight and sort of help introduce the panel, we're always looking for people interested in working with us. I think we've lined up a couple of other roundtable topics and speakers for the next few months. I think in March, in recognition of the UN status on women. I think we've got a topic on gender equity. I don't remember, Paul, but we will be sharing sharing all of that. We're usually on the fourth Tuesday of the month. For some reason, we thought that would be a nice quiet night for most people. So please feel free to join us and share with us any other thoughts or ideas you have. We're working on our plans already for a Workplace Promise Institute for September, so I'm going to be announcing that a lot. We've also been talking about converting some of our stuff to an associate membership program, and we are working on developing a newsletter. So lots of things hopefully going to happen for us in 2024. So see you next month, and I'm sure I will talk to some of you soon. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.